It's Rebecca. I eat books. It's May 1st. How great is that? May's a good month. June's a better month, but May is a good amuse-bouche to June. Let's talk about April. April was a month. April was the month I traveled to California. That was really nice. Remember when I did that, guys, and you came along? It was great. Remember the baby? It was great. I read 9 books in the month of April. These guys, and then 2 on my Kindle. The first book I read this month was Milkman by Anna Burns. I read this one in California while I was traveling. This tells the story of a middle sister who is living through the troubles in Northern Ireland, Belfast most likely, although it's not explicitly named. The writing style is phenomenal. The dry, dark humor is fantastic. I really loved this book. I did mention in my vlog when I first read it that I regretted having read it on a trip in which I was going in and out and not giving it my full attention. I think that this book really benefits from a sustained attended read. Somebody commented about another Anna Burns book after I read this, and I looked it up and it looks really good, so I'm definitely going to read some more Anna Burns in my life. I will say that as the month has progressed, I haven't thought a ton about this book, and that's sort of how I gauge my love of a book, is if it really sticks with me, and this one hasn't as much. Again, that could be a function of the fact that I read it the way I did in sort of a distracted, piecemeal kind of way. My first controversial read of the month was Real Life by Brandon Taylor, a booktube darling. Everyone loves it. I was not crazy about it. The writing style was not my favorite. All the characters seemed to sort of hate each other and be mean to each other. I found the sentences to be short and very dialogue heavy. This story is about a main character who is in a PhD program for something that my brain does the way my brain doesn't work. A lot of people talked about this as an academic book, which I love. I love books about academics, and because I'm incredibly biased, in my mind, the only thing that could have been is the humanities. Writers generally write about writing. So in my mind, I was like, oh, he's an MFA student. No, he's a scientist, which is not how my brain works at all. Somebody commented when I talked about how I wasn't crazy about the writing style. The writing style sort of seems like scientific observation or scientific notes, and that's so true. And that explains why I didn't get it. The next book I read this month was The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector, a sweet little novella. This was phenomenal and weird. This book has a male narrator who's telling the story of a female protagonist. The male narrator speaks directly to the reader, breaks down the fourth wall, is aware that he is writing a book. The relationship between the narrator and the protagonist, not explained. Do they live in the same reality? It's not clear. Is that reality the same reality we live in? Not clear. This is a dark story about class. Our protagonist is a poor woman from a certain area in Brazil that is rural and poor. Terrible things happen to her over and over again, and it ends in tragedy. This protagonist, I'm gonna mispronounce it, Macabea? Somebody comment. Anyone from Brazil? Macabea is depicted as this pathetic, lonely, ugly, poor woman who only bad things happen to. You can't help but wanting to hold her and say, don't worry, Macabea, I love you. It's gonna be okay. It's not, though. Your heart breaks a little bit with this one. All right, the next book I read this month was Acts of Desperation by Megan Nolan. This was an ARC kindly sent to me by Little Brown. I really enjoyed this. It's really dark. This is sort of a post-mortem on a relationship. A woman in present day, or I think 2019, is telling the story of her relationship from 2013, and that relationship is not a good one, and she has this perspective of the remove of years to have that conversation. The premise is that it's about this relationship, but obviously it's about this woman and the growth she's undergone in the interim between this relationship and when the story is being told. Trigger warning for sexual violence and rape in this book in a really dark way. One of the most disturbing instances of that I think I've ever read. It was hard. And this book is just a collection of all the impulses a young woman could possibly have to hurt herself. Drinking too much, starvation, men who treat us poorly, torturing ourselves with bad thoughts. Every way a young woman could hurt herself, you see in this book. All of those things that she's doing are out of a desperation to feel better, to feel love, to feel self-actualization in some way. When I was reading this, actually, I kept thinking like, this is the description and depiction of eating disorder that I wanted in Milk Fed by Melissa Broder. I just found this to be a much more nuanced discussion of those issues than I saw in Milk Fed, personally. This book would be impossible to digest if it weren't for that format of the future version of herself telling this story. If this were told in real time, it would be completely devoid of hope, but because we get to see this sense of reflection, this is the only thing that makes this book palatable to me. So that was a good form choice. And I do believe this is a debut, and I will be very curious to check out anything else that Megan Nolan writes. The next book I read this month was a NetGalley arc I read on my Kindle called Hot Stew by Fiona Mosley. This was an arc, although it has since been released. This book takes place in Soho in London. It is a commentary on class and gentrification in this neighborhood, very strongly rooted in this place. If you are from Soho or have understanding of that place, I think you would really love this book. It was very hard for me to understand all of the context because I've never been there. Also, this book has a humongous cast of characters. I've talked about this before, those types of books that have like an ensemble cast. This book has at least a dozen, probably more. I have a really hard time with books like that because it's just too much for me to keep track of. A million perspectives. You never get too deep with any of them because it's just not possible with this number of characters, which leaves me as a reader wanting more. Some of the characters in this book are sex workers, some are service workers, some are wealthy. This is obviously a book about class. Unfortunately, I found the argument to be sort of flat and lacking nuance. The uber wealthy development real estate baron, and she is very clearly the bad guy, and there's the prostitute with a heart of gold, those tropes, unfortunately. So ultimately, this wasn't my favorite read of the month. I'm curious if anyone else has read Hot Stew. I think it's gotten pretty good reviews. The next book I read this month was Blue Nights by Joan Didion. This is a later Joan Didion work and definitely not the strongest. The writing is beautiful. It does have that classic, beautiful Joan Didion writing that just cuts to the core. I mentioned in my reflection on Pure Flame, which I'll talk about, it was missing this like deep scratching the wounds personal essay ability that Joan Didion does so well. You'll never read a Joan Didion piece and be like, you know, she really didn't go there. Again, not her strongest. If you're gonna start with something, Joan Didion, My Year of Magical Thinking, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Don't start with Blue Nights. But Blue Nights is a story reflecting on her daughter's death. Her daughter died really suddenly, very shortly after her husband died very suddenly. It's meant to be a reflection on mothering, although ultimately it turns into a book about self-mothering because at the time of writing, Didion is aging and she is confronting the reality of getting old, the process of having to self-mother when your body is retreating into an infantile state, when you are frail and need care in a way that you didn't in middle age. I will say that reading this book in 2021, I recognize some really defensive pieces around privilege that are hard to read. Clearly, her daughter was ill and suffered, and she feels the need to say, you're not allowed to judge her privilege as a wealthy white person who took these amazing trips, stayed at the Ritz, and did all these absurd things. Only a child of John Donne and Joan Didion could like a life that is insane. And she's very defensive of that privilege and says, like, you're not allowed to judge her privilege because she suffered, when, like, obviously we know that you can be both privileged and suffer, and that we have an obligation to recognize our privilege and grapple with that, even in the light of the fact that we all suffer and we also all have differing degrees of privilege, and there's no way to confront privilege if we let suffering negate it. I'm curious to know if anyone else who's read this found that to interfere with the ability to empathize with the grief experienced by Didion in this book. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is for myself. The next book I read this month was Breasts and Eggs. This was a very well received book. I think it was on lots of books of the year's list last year, 2020, and I didn't love it. I did mention this in my most recent vlog. I talked a lot about this book, my experience reading it, and my struggle with this book being billed as a feminist tale. I've received some really good comments on that blog about how my inability to see this as feminist likely comes from my Western lens in reading this. There's just such a cultural difference between my experience of gender politics and the gender politics of Japan. This is a weird thing about reading books. We all come with our own lenses and our own biases. I love reading books in translation. I want to be mindful of my biases and my Western lens. I want to read with an open mind. I also want to have values and principles, and I felt a resistance to the gender politics that I've experienced in this book. Recognizing that might be cultural, that's also the experience that I had as I read it. Ultimately, I really loved the style of writing. I thought the voice was really strong. This book is separated into two pieces, book one and book two. Book one, Breasts. Book two, Eggs. Book one, Breasts, is about the narrator's sister coming to Tokyo to seek breast implants, and I found that to be far and away the much stronger of the two halves. The class commentary was really strong throughout both. Looming in both of these halves is this opportunity gap between Osaka and Tokyo, an ever-present looming shadow over this book. The next book I read this month was Pure Flame by Michelle Orange. This was an ARC kindly sent to me by FSG for our Strauss and Giroux, tentative publication date June 1st. Michelle Orange does have another book, This Is Running for Your Life, and I've never read it. Has anybody ever read This Is Running for Your Life? Let me know if you've ever read that. This book is about experiencing her mother's final days as her mother is dying of a lung disease. Her mother picked up a lung infection while she was working. The implication there being that basically she worked herself to death. Picked up this lung infection and didn't treat it because she was working too hard, and it has now come around to be the end of her life. Michelle is reflecting on her relationship with her mother as she's dying, the relationship they did or didn't have as she was growing up. She also weaves in a lot of feminist theory as it applies to her relationship with her mother. The central question being, what is the relationship between legacy and feminism? Do we inherit the legacy of feminism from our mothers? Do we carry their legacy forward, or do we reject their legacy in order to carry the legacy of feminism forward? This month I read this book as well as two other nonfiction female writers, Rachel Cusk and Joan Didion. Rachel Cusk and Joan Didion are true masters of the form. It really doesn't get better than Joan Didion or Rachel Cusk. So I thought this was a good book, but sandwiched between those two writers, it was hard not to notice the discrepancy in quality of writing for me. One piece of form that I really liked in this book is she intersperses with her writing text conversations that she has with her mother, and there is a very specific style of texting that mothers do. Lots of non sequiturs, some issues with punctuation. Found it very relatable and very real, and a really nice window into their relationship in a snapshot kind of way. The last book I read this month, which is a collection of essays, so I actually read it a little bit here and there throughout the month, was Coventry by Rachel Cusk. I mean, it's Rachel Cusk. What do you want me to say? It's beautiful. It is a collection of essays, so as always, some are stronger than others. The title refers to an essay that I had originally read in Granta a few years ago about her mother putting her on Coventry, which is basically like the silent treatment, how her mother would punish her with the silent treatment. For me, one of the most fun parts about reading this book was I felt like I had a window into Cusk's process as a writer. There are the seeds to so many of her works in these essays. There is an essay called Aftermath, which was then made into the book Aftermath, which is about her divorce from her first husband. So seeing where that came from. There's also some essays on art and creativity that I think really show the seeds to second place. Like reading some of these essays, you see like this is where she first started thinking through those issues that then became second place. One of my favorite essays in here was called Lions on Leashes, which was about having teenagers. There's also a whole section about writing and reflecting on the art of writing, and then also some criticism of different works. There's an essay about writing called How to Get There, and that title comes from a Karl Ove Knausgaard quote. Not what happens there, not what actions are played out there, but the there itself. That is writing's aim, but how to get there. If you've been around for a while, you know that Knausgaard is a person of hot debate here in this household. My husband Justin felt like he won a point by having Cusk in his corner. I always enjoy time with Cusk. Incredibly brilliant, and I have to give another thank you to Miriam from Another Book Thought for sending this to me. Can you believe that? She sent that to me as a gift. I have 2 more recommendations. The first is a podcast. Yes, I am about to recommend to you one of the most popular podcasts. Wow, thank you so much for giving me information I could have seen on the top 10 list of most popular podcasts. Invisibilia is back with a new season. There are new hosts this season. This is one of my perennial faves, love Invisibilia. The first episode of the new season is about a group of people in Burlington, Vermont, who during COVID pandemic times thought about ways to initiate reparations for African Americans in Vermont. And then there's just additional reporting on reparations and modern reparations and the ways that those initiatives have succeeded but mostly failed. I thought that was a must listen. Lastly, yes, I'm recommending another Brandon Taylor essay. Last month, I recommended a Brandon Taylor essay called I Read Your Little Internet Novels, which was about Lauren Euler and internet novels, which is something that I've talked about on this channel before. Then I read Brandon Taylor's book and didn't like it, and people came for me. But I'm back today with another Brandon Taylor essay recommendation that I think is good. I really enjoy Brandon Taylor's nonfiction. What can I say? Back in the day, I did the Could Do Better tag, in which I discussed the tiresome, overdone phenomenon of what I call colorful blobs. Roll the tape. Every single colorful blob cover. I'm really grateful today for the opportunity to have a platform to speak on this issue. They're everywhere. The colorful blob book cover phenomenon. Brandon Taylor wrote about it in his essay this week, and you'll be shocked yet again to hear that he did it in a much smarter, more thoughtful way than I possibly could have. He talks about how these colorful blobs are a product of the way that books are being marketed in less of a top-down way, but more of a person-to-person way. People on the internet telling you what books to read. Covers of these books are designed to give this quick message to you, to say this is a millennial text. Often this is a millennial text written by a woman or a gay person or a person of color, and how ironic it is that the capitalism of selling books is now relying on abstraction, these amorphous, abstract, colorful blobs. My recommendations and reads of the month. It was a good month. There were no 5 stars this month for me, which is fine. I was gluttonous for 5 stars in March. This was a just fine reading month. I'm looking forward to May. I have some holds languishing on my Kindle that need my love and attention. All right, thanks for watching. As always, I really appreciate you being here. Let me know your favorite read of the month. Mine has to be Coventry, but Hour of the Star is a close second. Happy May! Love you, nerds!